executed along the rest of the plans, which cover the entire county that I'm in, where the county borders the river, excepting Santa Ana, and then a neighboring county as well. So even though we got something that we're proud of with being able to keep Santa Ana open to the public for this fiscal year, after this fiscal year, that park's fate is still uncertain. And now we're facing a very different landscape with regards to our border wall fights in the surrounding areas. These walls come with waivers of legal safeguards for public health and environmental protections, and that puts at risk the environmental quality and public health of residents all along the border region. That's the same situation in California and Arizona, New Mexico, and of course here in Texas in Hidalgo County. The money that was allocated, we're talking $2 billion, is targeting the Rio Grande Valley, which is where I live. So if you look at the correlation between that money and our region, it's a direct correlation, which it has been interesting to work through being here on the ground. Our region has a lot of tourism that is dependent on our ecology. We have a lot of vibrant communities that are thriving economically within our thriving environment, and all of that is now at risk as a result of these $2 billion being allocated.
And when you talk about thriving communities, I mean, yes, there's, obviously biotic communities, but traditionally the border was more of an idea than a hard separating line, right? I mean, you had many families, communities, economies that just really intertwined there between Mexico and Texas, which I think is also true of places, like the greater San Diego, Tijuana area. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, how this also just impacts kind of the fabric of life there in the lower Rio Grande.
Absolutely. Our region, the borderlands on the Mexico and the US side, the borderlands have their own unique identity. We kind of grow up in between two places, and there's so many regional and cultural specifics that come with that are beautiful and that deserve to be honored and revered and valued. I grew up going back and forth to Mexico to visit family all the time, even though I was born here in the US. A lot of people, especially with what has been happening around DACA, families are being separated by this boundary, not only in the legal sense. For many people, it has been for many years a huge risk to go see family in Mexico. Some people simply cannot do that if they don't have proper documentation. But now we're talking physical boundaries and physical barriers, and that's influencing. It's almost impossible for me to talk about this without crying. So if I start crying, I'm just going to truck on through. But it's really devastating to see this happening, because our economies, our ecologies, and our cultures are the same on either side of the river. Just like if you live in a city that has a river going through it, it's still the same city on both sides. That's how we on the border feel about our neighbors to the south. They are our neighbors.
And Jacqueline, that was Jacqueline Trevino. She's an activist with a Borderlands activist there in the Southern Rio Grande. Also, here's Anthony Torres from the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program, and Sergio Avila, and we are talking again about border militarization, how it impacts the environment and human rights. Sergio, you heard Jacqueline talking there about walls and barriers, but it's important for people to know that it's not just like border militarization began when Trump was elected. This has been a long ongoing process. I'm wondering if you could talk about what you've seen the last 10 plus years working as a wildlife biologist there in the Sonoran Desert, and in general, the kind of larger scope. It's not just the wall. I mean, there already are barriers that are up.
Correct. Thank you, Jason. Yes, what's happening in the border right now, it's a long history that has divided our communities, natural and human communities. It all started maybe in the 80s when there was an initiative to start building infrastructure in urban areas, in border towns, with the express idea of pushing people towards more remote places, thinking that would deter them from traveling across the border. And that did not happen. That just put people at risk, and it created also other problems of lack of connectivity between shared ecosystems, shared deserts, shared rivers, shared mountains that now have barriers that separate them, not only for the animals that live in those places, but separate watersheds and the free movement of water, separate migration corridors. And in addition to the barriers, we have to think that what's going on in the border is more than just walls. There are roads. There's a huge network of roads in public lands. There are checkpoints. There are military operating bases. There are high power lights. There are generators. There are ATVs running around in roadless areas, in protected areas. And the impacts of all these affect nature and wildlife as a whole, not only individual species, but the connection, and very importantly, affect also their capacity to adapt to climate change, to adapt to drought, to migrate from lower elevation to higher elevation. And the devastation that's happening in our ecosystems, it's also reflecting into the quality of lives of people along the border and beyond.
Thank you so much for that, Sergio. I think, again, for people who don't live in the borderlands, they don't realize already how intensely the border is militarized. I was down there on a reporting trip, as you know, Sergio, last year, and you know, it's stunning, the militarization on the border. I think one day going from Nogales to Tucson, I went through something like 4 checkpoints. I don't think people who don't live in the borderlands realize the kind of day-to-day militarization that happens there. I do want to remind viewers the number of ways you can, if you've got a question on Zoom, you can put it there in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, just put it in the chat. If you're on Facebook, tell us where you're watching from, or on Zoom as well. I'd love to hear from you. Did you already know that, in fact, the Department of Homeland Security could waive laws in order to build roads, to deprive communities of protections of clean air and clean water in the borderlands? And also, if you are tuning in from the southern border, from California, Arizona, New Mexico, or Texas, have you yourself experienced a natural area that's been disturbed by border militarization, or have you yourself experienced the really heavy-handed kind of day-to-day law enforcement vibe there from Border Patrol? So please share those questions with us. In the meantime, Anthony Torres, you're from our Responsible Trade program. I'd love for you to maybe go back a little bit. And, you know, Trump's got all these kind of like wild ideas of there are caravans of people coming across the border, without sort of looking at the larger causes that kind of spur immigration from Latin America. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, these other kind of corporate, so-called free trade policies have fueled immigration.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. You know, in this debate over immigration, this critical question is often missing. Why? Why do people decide to leave their family and community, embark on a long and life-threatening journey, and start over in a country where they may be treated as second-class citizens or second-class residents? And among the many answers is one underreported fact, that U.S. trade deals like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Central American Free Trade Agreement contributed to economic instability that has forced many immigrants to have no choice but to leave home. And so those trade agreements not only eliminated jobs in the US, but especially in those Latin American countries where they exacerbated climate change, destabilized communities, reinforced the militarization of communities in the US, Mexico, and Central America. And those impacts, along with other root causes, fed into this increasing insecurity, displacement, and violence that forced many out of their communities. And after resettling in the US, you know, many of these immigrants live a daily life of at risk of being torn apart and forced from home yet again by deportation, and then also having to endure the risks and harms that come with living in pollution hotspots. We know that many immigrants are forced to live in communities with dangerous levels of air and water pollution. And so here at the Sierra Club, we believe that no one should be forced from home, and whether that be by unfair trade deals, climate change, or by deportation.
And Anthony, just want to stick with you for a second. I wonder if you could, or Jack, and really any of you, just what the xenophobic and sometimes I think outright racist rhetoric from the White House, how that's contributed to an overall atmosphere of fear and distrust in immigrant communities. And I think especially we're talking about Latino or Latin American immigrant communities here in the US.
I'm happy to speak to that at first, and then Anthony, please chime in at any time. So the fear and the emotional response that's happened within immigrant communities is not unwarranted, because people are being apprehended at a more aggressive rate than before. And we now have ICE going into communities and executing rates at a level, I mean, deportation has been happening all throughout the Obama administration. Deportation is not new. I'm not trying to imply that it is. However, this retaliatory effect that it seems to be taking. There have been cities that have made a strong stand against some of these policies. I'm thinking of an example of Austin wanting to be a sanctuary city, for example, and then ICE retaliated with coming into immigrant communities in that space and actually aggressively detaining people. So it's almost as though immigration enforcement is becoming a tactic to suppress the voice of the immigrant population in this country and of the residents of border lands in this country. And so the fear that people feel is not unwarranted. It's a very real thing. We talked about the militarization, and we are seeing that that militarization is increasing. I was at a Catholic church on Palm Sunday, and our community has a large Catholic population. We did a procession from the church, which is in the city of Mission, to La Lomita Chapel, which is on the other side of the levee. Now, this levee is where some of the new border wall that was just funded is going to go if we do get to the point where they're digging in the ground to build this thing in this location. And there were surveillance drones capturing the entire procession in the community park and picnic. This is at least the 10th year in a row that they've done this procession, and it was a faith-based community action, absolutely no risk to national security, but yet we were being surveilled. And that's just one of many instances of day-to-day life where the surveillance is increasing in combination with the increased rhetoric and xenophobia that we're seeing out of this administration. It feels very deliberate, and that's a scary place to sit, is in the crosshairs of something so deliberate.
That's a really...
Have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add on to what Jacqueline was mentioning, in that we know that deportation and the immigration enforcement in this manner is not new, but now the Trump administration is threatening to deport millions more based on just the idea of fulfilling xenophobic campaign promises. And, for me, I can just look to the story of Guadalupe Garcia de Rayos. In 1996, when she was 14 years old, she left the rural town of Acambado, Mexico, with her family to make a new life in Phoenix, Arizona. And she's lived there and established deep ties with her community and family in Phoenix for over 2 decades. And then just 2 weeks after Trump's inauguration, after he signed an executive order giving federal agents wider discretion to use racial and ethnic profiling to rounding up people, and especially those who have not even expressed, who have expressed those deep ties within the community, Guadalupe went to a routine check-in with federal immigration agents, and they promptly deported her back to Mexico within hours. Guadalupe was forced to leave the place she called home for 21 years and separated from her family, including her daughter, who at the time was screaming, "We don't deserve to go through this. No family deserves to go through this." And so those cases, to me, represent just the escalation of the threat that we are facing as the Trump administration seeks to pit communities against one another.
Yeah, those are, yes, please, Sergio.
There's no story that's more important than another, and these are very painful stories, and we can share so many. And I can tell you that while working to evaluate and assess the impacts of these policies along the border on the ecosystem and on natural systems, many of us researchers, people of color, people that look like me and have accents like I do, are also harassed because we're doing our work along the border. We're working on public lands. We're trying to understand what are the implications of these type of policies. And you cannot study nature. You cannot study animals in remote places when you have helicopters hovering over you, or when you have ATV patrols coming to your camp in the middle of the night just because you look like I do. So we are on the receiving end in all directions from these type of policies and this type of xenophobia. It affects a lot of people. It's very painful.
Yeah, thank you guys for sharing those stories. And Sergio, I can only imagine what it'd be like trying to, again, do field research as a working wildlife biologist there in the borderlands in that atmosphere of militarization. Again, for folks who's tuning in.
We have to add the militias and the Minutemen, who are people who are just out there heavily armed, more heavily armed than the same border patrol. And they are threatening, and they just look at people of color and they try to harass us. And there's more than the official harassment. There is also those who are emboldened by this type of behavior and bring out their guns.
Right. Just want to remind those folks who are just tuning in, again, this is a Sierra Forum talking about border militarization, the impacts of border militarization and Trump's proposed border wall on the environment and human rights. Again, if you're on Facebook, just drop your comment into the comments, and on Zoom, you can put a comment or question there in the Q&A. And we already do have some questions from folks who are tuning in. Tom Forlenza, joining us from Facebook, wants to know how the proposed border wall will affect, if at all, Big Bend National Park there in Texas. Wondering maybe Jacqueline or Sarah, if you can address what could be the impacts on Big Bend National Park.
Yeah, so the reality around the conversation with these walls in a lot of places, including Big Bend, is that the idea of a wall seems great, but if you actually look at the landscape and the layout of the terrain, these are not pragmatic places to build walls. So when you talk about a goal of putting, boundary to boundary wall, so from the Gulf of Mexico to wherever the other endpoint might be, what they have done, at least in my area, is taken the wall and pulled it farther away from the river. So we already have walls in the Rio Grande Valley, and these walls are placed 1 to 2 miles inland from where the river actually is. And that means that all of the land that's on the southern side becomes a no man's land, so to speak. It's a land where, because of the increased surveillance, people without proper documentation simply cannot go, or they put themselves at immediate risk of deportation. And then furthermore, anyone who goes there is subject to scrutiny. Every time I go to these lands, I'm asked, why are you here? What are you doing? Where's your ID? And that's because I have pale skin. People that have different colorations to their skin have very different experiences than I do, even though I'm still a Mexican woman. So where it would go in Big Bend, it's really hard to say. I know that the elected officials that represent that region are very vocal against walls. A lot of our elected officials on a border area, like in the Valley, are also very against walls. Would they go so far as to put the wall inland from Big Bend and say all of Big Bend is now no longer accessible to the public? I don't know, but that's what they're doing in our region. That's what they're doing down here in the Valley. So it is within the realm of possibility.
And I think what that illustrates is, again, when I've done some reporting in the Borderlands, I was talking with the sheriff of Santa Cruz County, Arizona, which is right there where Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora is. And he says, if you're from Iowa's flat, but in the Borderlands, it's like every hill has a valley, and after every valley, there's a gulch. I mean, it's this topography that's not going to lend itself to a wall. It's quite insane. Talking again about some of the environmental impacts, Marjorie Watson-Lay has got a comment here on Facebook. She says, what about an EPA report on the wall? I guess what she's trying to ask is, are there any other, government departments, say the Department of the Interior, the EPA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, who could do environmental impact statements and illustrate the significant consequences? Maybe Sergio or Jacqueline, you could address that.
Yeah, I'd like to say one thing and then I'll kick it over to Sergio. So yes, it would be amazing if the EPA would investigate the effects of the wall. It would be even more amazing if those findings were made accessible to the public. And something that all of you can do, there's something from our conversation earlier and then now that I'll bring up. All of you, if you're listening and if you are feeling empathy for us on the border region and you want to support us, the main things you can do is call your elected officials and make sure that you voice to them that you demand that they consider the rights of people who live along the border while we're having this conversation around immigration. And that would include pushing for all of the proper regulatory assessments that come with building this type of infrastructure. Because as it stands right now, they have the legal right to waive every single one of those assessments to build these projects. So as much as that seems very scary, and how could our democracy let that happen? That's exactly what we're up against. That's exactly what's happening. So the more that you reach out to your electeds and demand that if this is moving, at least we follow the course of law and we execute these regulatory assessments and have public forum conversations on what the implications of this infrastructure might be, the better off we might all end up in the end. The second thing is, before I kick it over to Sergio, all of us can be agents against xenophobia in our daily lives. So as you are living your life and as you are interacting with the people around you, if you see someone that is making comments about Mexicans or about immigrants, it's okay for you to say, I know this girl and she's out there in Texas and maybe I've never met her, but she seems like a good person and she's a Mexican. So maybe our thoughts are misguided. Let's talk about this together as a community. And if we see those conversations happening nationwide, we might start to turn the tide of this negative conversation in a way that gets to the root cause of why this is happening to my community. Thank you for letting me voice that, Sergio, if you want to add anything to the question.
I think you have it right, Jacqueline. People need to know that in 2005, the US Congress passed a law allowing the Department of Homeland Security, the secretary, which is an appointed secretary, to waive all social and environmental laws along the border in order to expedite the construction of this infrastructure. This means that the US Congress gave the president permission to ignore all the laws. This is why not only the EPA is not involved, the Forest Service is not involved, the National Park Service is not involved, the Bureau of Land Management is not involved, the Fish and Wildlife Service is not involved, because they made a law in order to avoid their involvement. These are public lands. This infrastructure is being built with public funds in our land as we all share it. And there is no public involvement. There is no period of comment. There's no review. There's no scientific research. There's no monitoring. There's nothing that is allowed because of this waiver. People need to know that Section 102 of the Real ID waiver of 2005, it's what's causing this problem, allowing the unchecked use of this militarization in public lands. And just to address really quickly the question about Big Bend, maybe there is not a wall. Maybe there is not a wall in Big Bend, but what there is that these policies are affecting the on-the-ground cooperation between agencies in Mexico and the United States. People also need to know that there is a huge protected area south of the border that is adjacent to Big Bend. Actually, that is a huge protected area on both sides of the border. It is called sister parks. And these type of policies affect the on-the-ground collaboration between agencies down there. Same thing in Arizona, in Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument and El Pinacate Biosphere Reserve in Mexico. In that place, there is vehicle barriers, and it is directly affecting the migration of pronghorn and directly affecting the collaboration of agencies that are taking care of the land down there.
You guys, we just have a couple more minutes. Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts, and thank you for all of your energy and your passion on this issue. Again, folks just turning in, this is a Sierra Club Forum discussion about border militarization and its impacts on the environment and human rights. I do want to, because you guys talking about how there's actually not that many abilities under the law because of the Real ID Act to stop this, but we do have a great question here from a talk show host, and I guess it's Salt Lake City, who wants to know, if this does seem inevitable, what are some effective roadblocks, I guess some effective strategies to stopping the law? I'm wondering maybe one of you could talk about the Sierra Club's legal actions here on that front. I mean, and again, Jacqueline already said,
Well, I think one of the things that we need to do is, again, repeal the Section 102 of the Real ID Act. That is what's giving this administration and administrations past the power to ignore the public in what is going on. The other thing that is making this issue very complex is that they're trying to put a solution, or they're suggesting a solution as a wall for problems that are far away from the borderlands, and the root causes are not being addressed. And then on top of that, dreamers are being affected and the environment is being affected. So it's like trying to create a one solution fits all. It's like having a shoebox where you just put one solution and then mix it and think that that's what's going to work. We need legislative, we need action, direct action, we need activism along the border, we need our representatives, everybody across the country, to say no to these type of policies, and we need to repeal Section 102 of the Real ID Act.
I've got one last question here, and it's a challenging one here. This is from João, who is watching on Facebook from Portugal. Thanks, João, for joining us. He says, the Sierra Club should be focusing on ecological and environmental problems first, and human rights, feelings, and xenophobia only afterwards, because there are many other NGOs that focus on that. I wonder if there's a response to João sort of explaining the intersections between, again, immigration policy, between a xenophobic immigration policy and the environmental consequences that Sergio and Jack and others have been talking about.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then folks, please chime in. Yeah, I mean, that's a question we often do hear in this work. And for us at the Sierra Club, we believe that the fight for immigrants' rights is directly tied to our mission. Our mission at the Sierra Club is to defend both the natural world and the human environment. And as we've been discussing today, the fight against a border wall and for immigrant rights is directly tied to issues of environmental justice. And the Sierra Club cannot actively win in any of these fights if we do not work alongside in solidarity with our partners in the immigrant rights movement and in the borderlands. And as I mentioned before, the root causes here are also issues that we are working on across the club. Trade deals allow these industries to pollute communities across borders and eliminate jobs and security and land for folks that destabilize and force migration here. So these issues of human rights and the environment are directly intertwined and directly fall into our work. And so when we look at it, it's not only a question of strategy and working together, it's also an issue of values. And so that's why the Sierra Club is not only supporting a vision for and support of healthy communities across borders, we're also fighting for a Clean Dream Act that doesn't pit communities or have to sacrifice one community to save another, and why we're also fighting to reject Trump's xenophobic approach that advances border walls, attacks on immigrants, and his climate denial agenda.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that really eloquent explanation of the connections between environment, immigration, and other social issues. I do just want to have a really important clarification. We do have a listener or a viewer, Liz Campbell, didn't catch the whole name of the law that Sergio was talking about. It's the Real ID Act. So real, and then ID as an identification Act of 2005. And it was mostly an anti-terrorism law passed sort of in response to September 11th, but it included all of these provisions about security, quote unquote, security along the southern border. So again, it's section, what is it, Sergio?
Section 102 of the Real ID Act.
Section 102 of the Real ID Act.
The recovery of the Katrina hurricane.
Well, folks, we're going to wrap it up. I do want to just take a minute or two to offer each of you, Sergio, Jacqueline, and Anthony, just again 30 seconds or so each to offer some final thoughts about why this issue is so important, and again, what Sierra Club members, supporters, volunteers across the country can do, even if they don't live, say, in the Santa Ana Valley, even if they don't live in the Sonora Desert or there in the California deserts, what else they can do.
Awesome. I'm happy to kick that off. The first thing I'd like to share in regards to what can you do, we already talked about becoming a voice for border residents and for immigrants in your community. That's probably the most important thing that you can take on. There's some other strategies at play with regards to stopping this project. I'm a firm believer that it's not done until it's done. Even though the money's there, even though it's coming down the pipeline, there's always opportunities for resistance. That's what the Sierra Club and the movements that we build in communities all over the US is all about. One thing that we are looking at is getting cities and counties to pass resolutions stating that they do not support border walls or these policies. And we've already gotten over a dozen of those passed in the Southern Texas region and across the United States. To take that a step further, we're now starting to push for cities and counties to say that they will not do business with border wall profiteers. And we are hoping that that will influence the private sector economic benefit that is being framed as coming from this project. And I feel that that could be a very efficient way for us to galvanize resistance in communities across the United States. No matter where you are, your city has the opportunity to take a stand.
Sergio or Anthony, anything else to add? Any final thoughts?
I will say that from the environmental perspective, nature has no borders. Plants and animals don't have political borders. They don't understand about them. And the impacts to plants and animals and the places where they live can be devastating, not only for those species and for those environments, but for people too. And that's where the environmental justice merges with social justice. And that's where Sierra Club is responding and breaking that paradigm that we should only stick to one topic. We're in fact addressing a topic that is broader than people think. And very proud and happy to work with Sierra Club that has had a national campaign for over a decade working to address social and environmental justice along the US-Mexico border.
As John Muir said, when you try to pull on anything, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. All these things are connected. Anthony, any final words from you?
Yeah, I would just reinforce, we at the Sierra Club are working with our allies to support and continue to drum up much more movement and public support behind the Clean Dream Act, which actually, rejects the notion that we have to put up a border wall in order to protect dreamers in our country. We're actually in support of all immigrants in this country who are entering this country seeking healthy and thriving communities. And also, as I mentioned, we have active campaigns to address these root causes that folks can get involved with, whether it's our Replace NAFTA campaign, whether it's our Borderlands work, and overall rising in solidarity with the immigrant rights movement at various different opportunities coming up. And so you can always, I think, reach out to any of us here on this webinar, as well as Sierra Club volunteers and allies, to plug into how do we build movements with our immigrant rights partners, our border communities, and with those fighting for human rights and environmental justice. Because together, we're going to be able to build the movement powerful enough to win justice for all.
Well, thank you guys so much for all of your work. Thank you for your leadership and vision on these issues. Again, thank you so much to the audience for tuning in, whether on Zoom or on Facebook Live. Again, these Sierra Forums are regular events. The next one is happening in June, and stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and keep on with your great works.
Thank you.